Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Vicksburg, Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The wagon wheels pressed deep tracks into the mud as they rolled toward the Russo plantation on that damp October morning in 1854. The property sat 8 miles east of Vicksburg, Mississippi, nestled between the rolling hills that eventually gave way to the great river. Rain had fallen steadily through the night, leaving the landscape draped in a heavy mist that clung to the cotton fields like a burial shroud. Jeremiah Tate, the overseer, rode ahead of the wagon. According to county employment records filed with the Warren County Clerk's office, Tate had been hired just 4 months prior, following the unexplained departure of the previous overseer. The Russo plantation was known throughout the region for its peculiar atmosphere. Not for any supernatural reason, such things have no place in historical record, but for the unusual silence that seemed to dominate the property. Visitors often remarked that even the slaves worked without their customary field songs, a detail noted in the private journal of Reverend Samuel Blackwood, who served as circuit preacher in the area from 1848 to 1861. The plantation house itself was a modest structure by Mississippi standards, particularly when compared to the grand mansions of Natchez, 30 miles to the south. Built in 1838, the 2-story white clapboard home had begun to show signs of neglect by 1854. Paint peeled from the columns and several shutters hung askew. The once meticulously maintained gardens had grown wild around the edges, as if nature itself was slowly reclaiming the boundaries of the property. Abigail Russo, aged 34 years according to the 1850 census records, had inherited the plantation following her husband's death in 1849. The cause of Charles Russo's death was listed simply as fever in county records, though local physician, Dr. James Wilkinson noted in his private medical ledger that the symptoms had been most unusual and rapid in progression. This ledger was discovered during courthouse renovations in 1961, according to an article published in the Vicksburg Evening Post, dated August 12th of that same year. The wagon that followed Tate contained supplies from Vicksburg, tools, fabric, salt, and other necessities that couldn't be produced on the plantation itself. It was a monthly journey that Tate had made 3 times before without incident. The driver, a free black man named Isaiah Johnson, would later provide testimony that would prove crucial to understanding the events that followed. As the wagon approached the main house, something immediately struck Tate as wrong. There was no movement, no slaves working in the yard, no smoke rising from the kitchen chimney. The windows of the main house were all shuttered, despite the late morning hour. According to his later statement to the Warren County Sheriff, recorded on October 28, 1854, Tate initially assumed that perhaps Mrs. Russo had taken ill, and the house staff was attending to her needs. He dismounted and approached the front door, calling out as he climbed the steps. No response came. The door was unlocked, unusual for a plantation house, even in daylight. The foyer was dark, the heavy damask curtains drawn against the morning light. A peculiar odor hung in the air, which Tate would later describe as reminiscent of wet earth and old copper. Modern forensic experts consulted for this documentary suggest this description is consistent with the smell of blood that has been exposed to air for several days. Isaiah Johnson remained with the wagon, as was customary. From his vantage point, he could see Tate enter the home. Minutes passed. Johnson later stated that he had begun to grow concerned when a figure appeared at an upstairs window, just for a moment, before the curtain fell back into place. Johnson was certain it was not Tate, as the overseer had entered through the ground floor, and insufficient time had passed for him to have gone upstairs. Inside the house, Tate moved from room to room on the ground floor. The parlor was undisturbed. Though a tea service sat abandoned on a side table, the liquid long since evaporated, leaving a dark residue in the china cups. The dining room showed signs of a meal interrupted. Plates of food, now covered in mold, still sat at 3 places around the table. Most unsettling was the kitchen, where Tate found the cooking fire cold, but a pot of stew still hanging over it, the contents congealed into a grey mass. Of the house slaves, there was no sign. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle, simply an absence where there should have been presence. Tate later reported that as he returned to the foyer, intending to check the upstairs rooms, he heard a sound from above, a slow, dragging footstep across the wooden floor. He called out Mrs. Russo's name. The footsteps stopped. What happened next has been pieced together from multiple sources. Tate's official statement, Isaiah Johnson's testimony, and fragments of a journal found hidden in the slave quarters during the subsequent investigation. These documents were collected in the Warren County Historical Society archives until 1958, when they were transferred to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History in Jackson. Researchers attempting to access these records in 1963 reported that the files had been misplaced during cataloging. Tate ascended the stairs, his hand resting on the pistol he carried. The upstairs hallway was dark, the doors to all 4 bedrooms closed. From behind one, he heard what he described as a sound like weeping, though somehow wrong in its rhythm. He approached the door to Mrs. Russo's bedroom and knocked. The weeping stopped. He opened the door. The official report filed by Sheriff William Hargrove on October 29, 1854, offers only the most clinical description of what Tate found. Mrs. Russo was present in the room, alive, seated in a chair facing the window. The bed showed signs of having been recently occupied by more than one person. A leather-bound ledger lay open on the writing desk, though its contents were not specified in the report. What the report does not include, but what Isaiah Johnson would later claim in a statement given to a journalist from the New York Tribune in 1872, long after he had relocated to Pennsylvania, was that Tate emerged from the house pale as death itself and ordered Johnson to ride immediately to Vicksburg to fetch the sheriff. When Johnson asked what had happened, Tate reportedly said only, "There are things no man should see and fewer still should speak of." Johnson departed immediately, leaving Tate alone at the plantation. When Sheriff Hargrove and 3 deputies arrived approximately 4 hours later, they found Tate sitting on the front steps of the house, his pistol in his lap. According to the sheriff's personal diary, discovered among his effects after his death in 1878, Tate looked up as they approached and said, "She won't let them leave, none of them, and now I fear she won't let me leave either." The sheriff and his men entered the house, leaving 1 deputy outside with Tate. What they discovered inside was detailed in a report so disturbing that the Warren County clerk sealed it by order of Judge Everett Wilson. This sealed report supposedly remained in the courthouse records room until 1891, when a fire destroyed much of the building's east wing. Whether the report burned or was removed before the fire remains a matter of speculation. What is known with certainty is that following the sheriff's investigation, Abigail Russo was removed from the plantation and committed to the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum in Jackson, where she remained until her death in 1859. The official cause of death was listed as failure of the heart, though asylum physician Dr. Thomas Kirkland noted in the medical record that the patient exhibited no previous symptoms of cardiac distress, but rather seemed to simply will herself to expire. The Russo plantation was sold at auction in 1855, but remained unoccupied for nearly a decade. Local residents avoided the property, though none would speak openly about why. In 1864, during the Civil War, Union forces commandeered the house as a temporary field hospital. The commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Whitman, wrote in his official dispatch that the men refused to sleep within the walls, preferring tents despite the December chill. The house was burned to the ground shortly thereafter, though whether by Union soldiers or local residents remains unclear. The fate of the slaves who worked the plantation has been pieced together through fragments of information. Of the 43 individuals listed in the plantation inventory of 1852, only 29 are accounted for in subsequent records. Some appeared in sale documents to other plantations in the region. Others were recorded as having escaped north during the chaos of the war. 14 simply vanished from all official records. In 1897, during construction of a new road connecting Vicksburg to Jackson, workers excavating near the former site of the Russo plantation uncovered a mass grave containing multiple sets of human remains. According to the Vicksburg Daily Herald dated June 7, 1897, authorities determined the remains were likely those of slaves, given the location and certain physical indicators such as healed fractures consistent with hard labor. The graves were unmarked, the bodies positioned in a manner that one worker described as resembling the spokes of a wheel, with the heads at the center. The county coroner estimated the burials had occurred approximately 40 years earlier, placing them around the time of the incidents at the Russo plantation. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery, noted in the coroner's report but omitted from newspaper accounts, that several of the skulls showed evidence of small holes drilled into the bone. Modern forensic archaeologists suggest such modifications were not consistent with any known burial practices of the time, either European or African in origin. Jeremiah Tate disappeared from Warren County records after giving his statement to Sheriff Hargrove. His name appears 3 months later in a ship's manifest departing New Orleans for Liverpool, England. What became of him after his arrival in Europe remains unknown. Isaiah Johnson's account, given years later from the safety of Pennsylvania, provides perhaps the most unsettling details of the case. According to the newspaper article published in the New York Tribune on November 12, 1872, Johnson claimed that as he was preparing to depart for Vicksburg, he witnessed something that haunted him for the remainder of his life. He described seeing several of the field slaves walking toward the main house, moving as if in sleep, their eyes open but unseeing. Leading them was Mrs. Russo, who Johnson claimed was speaking to them in a language he did not recognize. Most historians dismiss Johnson's account as sensationalism, noting that by 1872, stories of the supernatural had become popular in northern newspapers, particularly those involving the antebellum South. Yet certain details of his account align with evidence documented in the official investigation, suggesting at least some basis in fact. In 1927, a history professor from the University of Mississippi, Dr. Eleanor Caldwell, attempted to research the Russo case as part of a broader study of unusual legal proceedings in antebellum Mississippi. Her request to access what remained of the county records was denied. In a letter to a colleague dated March 3, 1927, Caldwell wrote, "I am met with silence or outright hostility when I mention the Russo name. One elderly gentleman at the Historical Society practically ordered me to leave when I inquired about the plantation. Whatever happened there, the people of Vicksburg still consider it best left buried." Dr. Caldwell abandoned her research shortly thereafter, accepting a position at Columbia University in New York. In a curious footnote, her personal papers, donated to the University of Mississippi archives after her death in 1954, contain a sealed envelope labeled simply "Russo, not for publication." University officials have consistently denied requests to open this envelope, citing respect for Dr. Caldwell's wishes. In 1961, during the Civil Rights Movement, a graduate student named Marcus Thompson became interested in the Russo case while researching the history of slave resistance in the Vicksburg area. Thompson managed to locate a descendant of one of the Russo plantation slaves living in Chicago. The elderly woman, whose name was withheld in Thompson's thesis at her request, shared a story passed down through generations of her family. According to this oral history, Abigail Russo had been investigating what she called old ways following her husband's death. She had become convinced that certain practices originating in West Africa could be used to increase the productivity of her slaves while ensuring their absolute obedience. The woman's ancestor claimed that Mrs. Russo had acquired a book of some kind from a sailor who had spent time on the Guinea coast and had begun performing rituals in the slave quarters at night. Thompson's academic advisors insisted he remove this account from his thesis, dismissing it as unprovable folklore. Thompson complied, but included a note in his personal research files, now held by the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York, stating, "The physical evidence found at the plantation site in 1897, particularly the arrangement of the bodies and the modifications to the skulls, suggests that something far more systematic and deliberate than random violence occurred on the Russo property." In 1964, a reporter for the Vicksburg Evening Post named Richard Carter published a series of articles about local historical mysteries. When he attempted to include the Russo case, his editor refused, citing a lack of verifiable sources. Frustrated, Carter conducted his own investigation, tracking down elderly residents whose grandparents had lived in the area during the 1850s. One such resident, Harold Blackwood, a descendant of Reverend Samuel Blackwood, shared a story that had been passed down through his family. According to Blackwood, his great-grandfather had been called to the Russo plantation approximately 1 month before the incidents of October 1854. Mrs. Russo had requested he perform a blessing of the property, claiming that unquiet spirits were disturbing her sleep. The Reverend reported finding the slaves in a state of extreme distress, though they refused to speak to him directly. Most troubling to the Reverend was his discovery of strange symbols drawn in what appeared to be blood on the interior walls of the slave cabins. When Reverend Blackwood confronted Mrs. Russo about these findings, she reportedly told him, "They belong to me, body and soul. What I do with them is between myself and God." The Reverend departed the plantation and never returned. 1 week later, his church board received a substantial donation from Mrs. Russo, along with a letter requesting that the Reverend's circuit be adjusted to exclude her property. Carter never published these findings. His notes were discovered among his effects after his death in 1987, along with a letter addressed to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, declining to donate his research materials related to the Russo case. In the letter, Carter wrote, "Some histories I have concluded are best left undisturbed. I have destroyed my interview recordings and will burn my notes before my death." The land where the Russo plantation once stood remained abandoned well into the 20th century. Local farmers avoided it, claiming the soil there was sour and would not support crops. In 1972, a developer purchased the land with plans to build a subdivision. During the initial survey, workers reported equipment malfunctions and unusual cold spots. The project was abandoned after the lead developer suffered a fatal heart attack while walking the property line. Today, the site is part of a nature preserve. Hikers occasionally report hearing what sounds like distant voices when passing through the area where the main house once stood. Wildlife officials note that certain animals, particularly birds, seem to avoid the specific location despite the abundance of suitable habitat. What truly happened at the Russo plantation in the days leading up to October 28, 1854, will likely never be known with certainty. The official records have been lost, destroyed, or deliberately suppressed. The witnesses are long dead. All that remains are fragments of documentation, oral histories of questionable reliability, and the physical evidence uncovered decades later. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case is the way it was systematically erased from local history. Unlike other antebellum atrocities, which were at least acknowledged even if not properly addressed, the events at the Russo plantation seem to have been deemed too disturbing to remember. It is as if by unspoken agreement, an entire community decided that some horrors are too great to incorporate into the historical narrative. In 1959, exactly 100 years after Abigail Russo's death at the asylum, the administrator of the facility discovered a sealed envelope in a vault containing patients' personal effects. Inside was a single page, torn from what appeared to be Russo's personal journal. The page, now preserved in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, contains just one legible entry, dated October 23, 1854, 5 days before Jeremiah Tate's discovery. They are mine. The book shows the way. Their bodies labor in the fields, but their minds travel roads no living man was meant to walk. Through them, I have glimpsed what lies beyond. Charles would be proud of what I have accomplished. Soon I will join him, and we will never be parted again. The rest of the journal, if it ever existed, has never been found. In 1968, during renovations of the old asylum building, workers discovered a small cavity in the wall of the room where Abigail Russo spent her final years. Inside was a small cloth doll, crudely made from what laboratory analysis would later identify as human hair and fragments of cotton fabric. Embedded in the chest of the doll were 43 small pins, the exact number of slaves owned by the Russo plantation at the time of the incidents. To this day, the road that passes nearest to the former plantation site is known locally as Whisper Road, though no official map designates it as such. Local residents still take the long way around rather than use this route after dark. When asked why, most simply shake their heads and say some traditions don't need explaining. The truth of what occurred at the Russo plantation remains buried, like so many uncomfortable aspects of American history. But in the silence that has grown around it, in the deliberate forgetting, perhaps we can discern the outlines of a horror too great for even the brutal standards of its time. Whatever Jeremiah Tate saw in Abigail Russo's bedroom that October morning changed him enough to flee not just Mississippi, but America itself. Whatever Isaiah Johnson witnessed as he departed for Vicksburg haunted him for the remainder of his life. And whatever was done to those 14 missing slaves was disturbing enough that an entire community chose to pretend it never happened. Some silences, it seems, speak volumes, and some histories once buried leave behind echoes that never truly fade. In 1932, a linguistics professor from Tulane University named Dr. Martin Everett came across a reference to the Russo case while researching regional dialects in Mississippi. His academic curiosity piqued. Everett traveled to Vicksburg, hoping to uncover more information. According to his private correspondence with a colleague, now preserved in Tulane's archives, local officials were remarkably uncooperative. The county clerk claimed relevant records had been lost in the courthouse fire of 1891, while the Historical Society denied having any material related to the Russo family. Undeterred, Everett sought out elderly residents whose families had lived in the area for generations. Most refused to speak with him once they learned his interest in the Russo plantation. However, one woman, identified in his notes only as Mrs. G, agreed to meet him at her home outside of town. Mrs. G claimed to be a descendant of a family that had owned a neighboring plantation. According to her account, recorded in Everett's research journal, there had been rumors about Abigail Russo even before the events of 1854. Following her husband's death, Mrs. Russo had become increasingly reclusive, venturing into Vicksburg only when absolutely necessary. On those rare occasions when she did appear in public, witnesses described her as altered somehow, as if standing adjacent to herself. Most disturbing was Mrs. G's claim that her grandmother had once attended a dinner party at the Russo plantation in early 1854. During the meal, Mrs. Russo had allegedly discussed her experiments with alternative methods of discipline that allowed her slaves to work longer hours without rest. When one guest expressed concern about the morality of such practices, Mrs. Russo reportedly replied, "They have no souls to damage, and I have found a way to make use of that absence." The dinner party story appeared in none of the official records related to the case, and Everett himself expressed skepticism about its veracity in his notes. Nevertheless, he was sufficiently intrigued to extend his stay in Vicksburg, hoping to corroborate the account with other sources. 2 weeks into his research, Everett abruptly abandoned the project. In a letter to his department chair at Tulane, dated June 18, 1932, he wrote, "I find I must return to New Orleans immediately due to a family emergency." No such emergency is documented in his personal papers, and colleagues reported that upon his return, Everett refused to discuss his time in Vicksburg. He never published any findings related to the Russo case, and his research materials on the subject were conspicuously absent from his academic papers donated to Tulane after his death in 1957. In 1948, a geology student from the University of Mississippi conducted soil samples from various locations around Warren County as part of his master's thesis. One sample, taken from the former Russo plantation site, contained unusual concentrations of iron, salt, and an unidentified organic compound. When the student, Robert Matheson, attempted to analyze the compound further, the sample was accidentally destroyed in a laboratory accident. Matheson noted the anomaly in his thesis, but did not pursue it further. His faculty advisor discouraged additional sampling from the site, citing concerns about trespassing on private property, despite the land being part of a public nature preserve at that time. The most tantalizing lead in the Russo mystery emerged in 1953, when renovations at the Mississippi State Archives uncovered a previously unknown storage room containing records thought to have been destroyed decades earlier. Among these was a thin file labeled Russo Inquest, Warren County, 1854. Archivist Thomas Mitchell catalogued the file, but noted that it contained only a single document, a partial transcription of testimony given by Dr. James Wilkinson, the physician who had treated Charles Russo before his death in 1849. In the testimony, dated October 30, 1854, Dr. Wilkinson described being called to examine the slaves at the Russo plantation following the sheriff's initial investigation. His clinical observations were recorded in dispassionate medical language, but the content was nonetheless disturbing. He documented finding 29 of the plantation's 43 slaves in a state he described as conscious insensibility. They responded to basic commands, but showed no awareness of their surroundings and no reaction to painful stimuli. Most alarmingly, Dr. Wilkinson noted that each of these individuals bore a small, precise incision at the base of the skull, which he initially believed to be surgical in nature. However, upon closer examination, he determined that the wounds had not been created with any medical instrument with which he was familiar. The incisions had healed partially, suggesting they had been made some weeks prior to his examination. The remaining 14 slaves were nowhere to be found on the property, despite the sheriff's men searching the surrounding woods and fields. Dr. Wilkinson's testimony concluded with his professional opinion that whatever procedure was performed on these individuals represents a profound violation of both medical ethics and human dignity. The full transcript was never located, and the partial document itself disappeared from the archives by 1955, when researcher Eleanor Caldwell attempted to access it. The archivist who had originally catalogued the file, Thomas Mitchell, had by then relocated to California and could not be reached for comment. In 1967, author William Faulkner's unpublished notes were being organized by his estate when researchers discovered a folder containing material for an apparently abandoned novel. The folder, labeled Bondsman's Burden, contained character sketches and plot outlines for a story set on a Mississippi plantation in the 1850s. The protagonist was to be an overseer who discovers that the plantation mistress has been conducting unspeakable experiments on her slaves. Faulkner's notes include references to historical research he had conducted, including interviews with elderly residents of the Vicksburg area. One notation reads, "On case, facts more disturbing than any fiction, not suitable for publication." Literary scholars have debated whether Faulkner had indeed uncovered information about the Russo case, or if the similarities were coincidental. Faulkner himself never publicly acknowledged any connection to the historical events, and the novel remained unwritten at the time of his death in 1962. Perhaps the most scientifically rigorous investigation of the Russo plantation site occurred in 1959, when cultural anthropologist Dr. Helen Morris led a team from the University of Chicago in an archaeological survey of antebellum plantation sites in Mississippi. The team spent 3 weeks excavating the area where the Russo main house and slave quarters had stood, meticulously documenting their findings. Their official report, published in the Journal of Southern Historical Archaeology in 1960, described discovering the foundations of both the main house and 7 smaller structures identified as slave cabins. Beneath the floor of one cabin, the team uncovered a small chamber, approximately 6 feet square and 4 feet deep, lined with a substance initially identified as clay, but later determined to be a mixture of clay, ash, salt, and organic material, including human blood. The chamber contained several artifacts: ceramic vessels of African design, small bone carvings, and metal implements of unknown purpose. Most significant was the discovery of a leather-bound book written in a combination of English, French, and what linguistics experts identified as a Bantu dialect from the Congo region. The book contained detailed anatomical drawings of the human brain and nervous system, interspersed with text describing procedures for separating consciousness from will. Following the publication of Morris's findings, the University of Chicago received pressure from unnamed sources to distance itself from the research. The artifacts were transferred to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History for proper cataloging and preservation. When Morris attempted to access them for follow-up research in 1963, she was informed that the items had been misplaced during a reorganization of the collection. The leather-bound book was never officially catalogued and effectively vanished from the historical record. Dr. E. Morris herself became increasingly paranoid in the years following her research at the Russo site, according to colleagues. She resigned from the University of Chicago in 1965 and retreated to her family home in Vermont, where she reportedly refused all contact with former academic associates. In a rare interview granted to a local newspaper in 1971, Morris stated cryptically, "There are things buried in our history that should remain buried. I made the mistake of unearthing one of them. In 1978, the Mississippi State Hospital, formerly the State Lunatic Asylum, where Abigail Russo had been confined, undertook a comprehensive digitization of its historical patient records. During this process, archivist Dr. Susan Chen discovered a series of treatment notes related to Russo's case that had not been included in the official medical record. These notes, written by asylum physician Dr. Thomas Kirkland, described Russo's behavior during her 5 years of confinement in unusually detailed terms. According to Dr. Kirkland, Russo spent hours each day engaged in what he termed one-sided conversations, speaking in multiple languages to individuals who were not present. She drew complex diagrams on the walls of her room, which the staff repeatedly painted over, only to find new drawings appeared overnight. Most disturbing was Kirkland's observation that other patients housed near Russo began to exhibit similar behaviors, including speaking in languages they had no way of knowing and drawing the same symbols on their own walls. In his final entry, dated just 3 days before Russo's death in 1859, Kirkland wrote, "I can no longer dismiss the possibility that Mrs. R's condition represents not mental deterioration, but mental expansion of a sort beyond conventional understanding. What she knows, or believes she knows, cannot be reconciled with natural law as currently understood. I have requested her transfer to isolation for the safety of other patients, and indeed for the safety of all who come in contact with her." Dr. Chen's discovery was documented in an internal hospital report, but was never published in any academic journal. The original treatment notes were supposedly transferred to the state archives, but researchers have been unable to locate them in subsequent years. In 1982, novelist and historian Shelby Foote received a package from an anonymous sender while researching his comprehensive history of the Civil War. The package contained photocopies of what appeared to be pages from Sheriff William Hargrove's original report on the Russo case, the same report believed to have been destroyed in the courthouse fire of 1891. Foote never incorporated this material into his published work, but in a 1995 interview with the Oxford American, he alluded to a case in antebellum Mississippi so disturbing that it defies historical categorization. After Foote's death in 2005, his literary executor discovered the photocopied pages among his research materials. Their authenticity has never been verified by historical experts, and the original documents, if they exist, have never surfaced publicly. The photocopies themselves were donated to the University of Mississippi archives with the stipulation that they remain sealed until 2175 years after the events they describe. In 1998, construction workers excavating for a highway expansion near the former Russo plantation site uncovered human remains that had not been discovered during the 1897 finding. Unlike the earlier discovery, these remains were not arranged in any pattern, but appeared to have been hastily buried. Forensic anthropologists from the University of Tennessee examined the remains and determined they belonged to 3 adult individuals who had died approximately 150 years earlier. The most notable finding was that each skull contained a small, precisely drilled hole at the base, similar to those described in Dr. Wilkinson's testimony. Trace evidence suggested that a metal implement had been inserted through these holes into the brain tissue. The anthropologists' report theorized that the procedure would have been fatal, yet other evidence indicated the individuals had survived for some time afterward, based on bone growth around the drill sites. This discovery briefly reignited interest in the Russo case among historians of antebellum Mississippi. However, mainstream academic publications remained reluctant to address the story directly, perhaps due to its disturbing implications about the extremes of human cruelty during the slave era, or perhaps due to the fragmentary nature of the available evidence. In 2009, documentary filmmaker Rebecca Lawson began researching the Russo case for a proposed film about forgotten histories of the antebellum South. Despite initial enthusiasm from production companies, Lawson encountered numerous obstacles, interview subjects cancelled without explanation. Archives reported that relevant materials were unavailable due to ongoing conservation efforts. Local officials in Vicksburg were politely unhelpful, directing her to the same limited sources that had been public knowledge for decades. After 6 months of frustrated efforts, Lawson abandoned the project. In a blog post that was quickly deleted but preserved by Internet archiving services, she wrote, "I've never encountered such a coordinated resistance to historical inquiry. It's as if an invisible barrier has been erected around this particular case." The question is whether this represents an institutional desire to suppress a particularly shameful episode in American history, or something more personal, a collective agreement among those with connections to the story that some truths are too disturbing to excavate. The former Russo plantation site remains undeveloped to this day. It lies within the boundaries of the Vicksburg National Military Park, but is not marked on any official maps or mentioned in any park literature. Park rangers discourage visitors from venturing into the area, citing concerns about unstable ground and hidden sinkholes. Local residents still avoid the location, particularly after dark. In 2018, ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted as part of an environmental impact study revealed anomalies beneath the soil where the main house once stood. The technology indicated the presence of a chamber approximately 15 feet below the surface, roughly 10 feet square. The environmental survey team recommended further investigation, but the proposal was rejected by county officials, citing budget constraints. What truly happened at the Russo plantation in the autumn of 1854 remains one of the most disturbing, unsolved mysteries of antebellum America. The fragmentary evidence suggests a collision of cultures, beliefs, and practices that resulted in atrocities beyond the already considerable horrors of slavery itself. Abigail Russo appears to have discovered or developed techniques for controlling her human property that crossed boundaries even her contemporaries found unacceptable. The persistent efforts to suppress information about the case, spanning generations and involving multiple institutions, suggest a collective desire to forget, not merely out of shame for the past, but perhaps out of fear that certain knowledge, once released, cannot be contained again. Isaiah Johnson, the wagon driver who witnessed the beginning of the investigation, perhaps said it best in his 1872 interview. "Some evils you can name, and in naming them, begin to overcome them. But what happened at the Russo place has no name in any language I know, and perhaps that's for the best." Today, the forests have reclaimed most of the land where the plantation once stood. Nature has erased nearly all visible traces of the structures where those unnamed atrocities occurred. Yet something intangible remains, a heaviness in the air, a quality of silence that seems to absorb rather than reflect sound. Local tour guides who lead groups through the Vicksburg National Military Park occasionally point in the direction of the former Russo land, though they never venture close. That area has never been properly surveyed, they tell curious visitors. It's not exactly a lie, but it's far from the whole truth. The full truth may never be known. The principal witnesses have been dead for over a century. The most revealing documents have been lost, destroyed, or deliberately hidden. All that remains are fragments and whispers, pieces of a puzzle too incomplete to form a coherent picture. Perhaps that incompleteness is a mercy. Some chapters of history once fully revealed might prove too heavy for the human conscience to bear. The case of Abigail Russo and the 43 souls who suffered under her control may belong to that category of truths best left partially obscured. And yet, there is value in remembering that such mysteries exist, in acknowledging the dark spaces in our historical record where the light of full understanding has never reached. For in those shadows lie lessons about the extremes of human capability for both innovation and cruelty, and warnings about the dangers that arise when one human being claims absolute ownership of another. The wagon wheels that carried Jeremiah Tate to his discovery on that October morning in 1854 left no lasting impressions on the soil. The screams that may have echoed across the plantation in the preceding days left no vibrations in the air. The suffering of those 43 human beings left few traces in our historical record, but somewhere, in faded documents and buried bones, in folklore and fragments, in nightmares and whispered warnings, the truth of what happened at the Russo plantation continues to exist. Not as a complete narrative, but as a shadow, a negative space in our understanding that, by its very emptiness, reveals something profound about the history we have inherited and the responsibilities we bear to face it honestly. As the sun sets over Vicksburg on autumn evenings, the light takes on a quality that photographers call the golden hour. The rolling hills cast long shadows, and for a brief moment the landscape appears both beautiful and somehow more truthful, with every contour and crevice thrown into sharp relief. In that revealing light, one might stand at the edge of what was once the Russo plantation and sense the weight of its unresolved history, the questions that still hang in the air like the Mississippi mist, waiting for answers that may never come. And perhaps, if one listens carefully in the gathering dusk, one might hear something like a whisper carried on the evening breeze. Not words exactly, but the faintest suggestion that some stories, no matter how deeply buried, refuse to remain entirely silent.